Hello, it's me again. Well, the country is still in lockdown because of this COVID-19. So I've decided to tell you a few more of my memories of growing up in the early 40s. Well, as I said, I was born in 1939. By the time I was 5, nearly 6, I had 2 little brothers. This is a photograph of me when I was 2. I think I was about 2 there, 18 months old or 2. Well, I can remember the day I started school. I had on a grey skirt, little red jumper and grey socks. And, of course, the big floppy bow in my hair. Well, at the school there were 2 little girls. Well, they weren't dressed like me. They didn't have a skirt and jumper. They were in satin dresses. One was in pink satin and one was in blue satin. And I was convinced they were the royal princesses, Princess Margaret Rose and Princess Elizabeth. I was so excited and I couldn't wait to go home to my lunch to tell my mum that the royal princesses were going to my school. But of course, it wasn't the royal princesses, and she soon put me right. In the school, we had a hall, a big hall, and every afternoon we used to have to go for a nap. The early children, the youngest class, would have to go for a nap. And we were each given a little mat, and they were really hard and scratchy, and they were made of coconut matting. But we had to lie down, and we had to try to have a little sleep. In the hall, there was a big rocking horse. It stood in front of a great big window, this huge rocking horse. To me it seemed about 10 foot tall, but obviously it wasn't. And if we were especially good, we could have a ride on the rocking horse. So that was nice. In those days, the dentist used to come to the school to check our teeth. And I can remember one day I was called to see the dentist. I sat in the high chair. He looked into my mouth and he said, "Oh, there's one there that can come out." He said, "I'll take that out after lunch." Well, I went home in tears, telling my mum that when I went back to school, the dentist was going to take my tooth out. So mum said, "Let me have a look." She had a look and she said, "Oh, yes, it is quite loose, that one there." She said, "Would you like me to take it out for you?" So mum put a towel round her fingers and she reached in and whipped out the tooth. So when I went back to school, I was called in to see the dentist. In the high chair I sat. The dentist looked into my mouth and he said, "Oh, it's gone." I said, "Yes, sir. My mummy took it out when I was at lunch." Or whether he was pleased or not, I don't know. Anyway, that's the earliest memory I have of the dentist. Now, in the summer when it was nice, we would go and have tea with an aunt and uncle in the next village, which was about 2 miles away, and it was through the lanes. And we would go with the mum and dad and the children in the pram. The 2 boys would be in the pram, and mum would put a piece of wood across the base of the pram, at the foot of the pram, and I would sit on that. So all 3 of us were in the pram. And we walked to visit Auntie Gert and Uncle Tom for Sunday tea. After tea, the grown-ups would play cards, or Uncle Tom would play a tune on his accordion, a little squeeze box, and I would curl up in a chair with my crayons and a colouring book, or play with my older cousins that lived there. When it was time to leave, it was always dark. We walked back through the lanes in the dark, no street lights, just Dad with his torch. And Mum would tell us stories about a little dog called Pickles. And these were stories that my mum would have made up. And we used to love listening to the stories of Pickles. The 3 of us on the one pram. And I can remember that so clearly. There was one farm along the lane, and whenever we passed that farm, a dog would bark like mad, and it would frighten us to death until we got used to it, and we knew that once we got to that farm, the dog would start barking. But it never came out. It was just making a lot of noise. Anyway, that was quite nice. Now, Dad worked at a mill, and this mill made animal feeds, grass nuts and calf nuts and things like that for the farmers. And he would deliver the food with a horse and cart to various farms around the area, around Somerset. And on a Sunday, he had to go down to see to the horse, and I would go with him. But very soon, the mill started buying lorries, and Dad could then deliver it much further afield. Not just Somerset, but Devon and not Cornwall, that was too far. Dorset and Wiltshire. Which was nice, because on a Saturday I could go with Dad in the lorry. And I could watch the cows being milked while Dad was unloading the feed for the farmer. And sometimes I could go to the dairy and watch the farmer's wife making butter in a big wooden churn, just stirring. And they'd let me have a go, but it was much too heavy for me to stir. But that was quite nice. That was interesting. And then sometimes the whole family would go with Dad. Mum and the two boys and I would pile into the lorry, and we would go with Dad, and he would drop us off somewhere and pick us up later on the way home. Well, we had a lot of aunts and uncles that lived around the country, and Dad would drop us at one of the aunts' house, and we would have a cup of tea and a chat, and then Dad would call in on the way back and pick us up and take us home. Sometimes he went to a place like Burnham-on-Sea where there was a beach, and he would drop us at the beach, and again he would pick us up on the way home about an hour or so later. And that was lovely. And I would go to the cinema in the afternoon at the children's matinee, and I would tell my friends I'd been to the seaside this morning, and none of them believed me. But anyway, we were lucky we were able to do that, because not many people had cars in those days. Now, groceries were a bit different, because everything had to be on ration, and you had to have a coupon in a little book. And you couldn't buy just what you wanted. You could choose to a certain extent, but it was only tiny portions, and there was an allowance for everything. Even butter. We didn't get a whole block of butter. It would be a block cut in half. And I think we were allowed something like 2 ounces of butter each a week for grown-ups. And sugar came in little blue bags. What would happen was once a week, the lady from the co-op would come along on her bicycle. She'd come in and sit down, and Mum would tell her what she wanted. She would write down her list. And then the following week, the man from the co-op would turn up in his van with a big wicker basket and put it on the table and carefully count out our rations for that week. Sometimes you could exchange something with a neighbour or a friend. And I know my mum used to exchange some things with a friend to get extra cheese, so Dad could have cheese for his sandwiches for lunch. We also kept chickens, so we were okay for eggs. And if we had a lot of eggs, Mum would put them in a big earthenware jar and cover them with something called isinglass. It was like a jelly that coated the eggs. And because the eggshells are porous, this would stop the eggs going bad. I think a lot of people kept hens in those days. And Dad was lucky because of calling round to the farms. The farmers would give him extra bits and pieces, and sometimes he would get a little pat of butter or something, a little treat from the farmer. Sometimes a rabbit, so we could have rabbit stew. So we were luckier than a lot of people. And sometimes Dad would have to go to the docks to collect the feed that had come across from another country on the boats. And then he always had a little perk as well. And I can remember he was given some bananas one day. Well, we were so lucky, but we didn't have to tell anyone at all that we had bananas because bananas were extremely rare. So again, we were quite lucky there. Now, I can remember there was a fire at the mill too. That was quite frightening. All the men had to go down and help with putting the fire out and replacing things once the fire had gone out. And I can remember the smell. It was quite frightening, the smell, and it was sinister. And we would go down with sandwiches in a flask for Dad because they just had to stay there until this was all sorted out. But, the mill came back okay, and eventually it was rebuilt. And Dad worked there practically all of his life at the mill. But he thoroughly enjoyed it. But Mum, she didn't like it very much because the pay was very poor, and she kept trying to get Dad to try and move to find a job somewhere else. But Dad loved his job at the mill, and he was very happy there. Well, I think that's all for today. I'll try and think of something else to tell you another time. So this is the end of episode 2. Bye for now. Bye-bye.